Broadly speaking, the body politic is comprised of three sets: A, B, and C. All three sets believe in some change of some form, and routinely they even agree on the change necessary, but they will necessarily disagree on how to get there. Set A is the people we casually call leftists, social democrats, or even communists, or liberals for our American friends, though there is hardly anything liberal in Set A. Of course, there are degrees. Not all social democrats are communists, for instance, but they all believe collectivism and coercion is preferable and indeed a good thing. They distrust liberty and they tend to trust authority, within some limits. Set B is the people we casually call right-wingers, conservatives, or even libertarians, or liberals for our European friends, since in Europe, liberal still sort of means roughly the same as it meant 100 years ago. And again, of course, there are degrees. Not all right-wingers are libertarians, but they all believe individualism and a high dose of liberty is preferable and indeed a good thing. They trust liberty and individual agency, and they tend to distrust authority, again within some limits. And then there's Set C, which is the people who don't really fit into the first two, but not because they're moderate, but rather because they're crazy. Individuals in Set C will casually support policies of both Set A and Set B for various reasons, usually conspiratorial or fundamentalist. In Set C, you'll find people casually referred to as religious fundamentalists, conspiracists, anarchists, and plain-out crazy in the very clinical sense. Snobs in both Set A and Set B tend to think of those in Set C as somewhat closer to the other set. Of course, in believing so, they actively help the other set, for decision-making necessary involves Set C, and usually whoever gets a bigger share of the Set C wins. Usually, though not always. And that's because Set A and Set B collectively make 80% of the body politics. Sometimes Set A has 45% and Set B only 35%, but it is very rare for one set to become over 50% of the body politic. Usually, none of the first two sets can dominate without at least some help from Set C. Set C is usually around 20% of the body politic. Now, every 10 years, the composition of Set C changes through political realignment. That is to say, while the proportions remain roughly the same, the people in them are not the same. People change from Set A to B, or from B to C, or from C to either A or B all the time. But roughly every 10 years, this becomes more visible. And every 40 years or so, the routine realignment is so profound that they even bring profound changes with them. The last profound realignment occurred around the year 1980, and we're due for a new one. Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Alright, so this is a video that I kept on postponing because this isn't an easy argument. The premise is based on the fuzzy set theory from mathematics, and the framing I took from a Romanian author with whom I disagree on most topics, but who also has a similar experience with me, namely over 100 countries visited, keen interest in politics, and knowledge of mathematics and computer science. What I will do here is to present a generalized theory, which is in part original work, alongside examples to show its consistency across cultures and political systems, and then, at the end, get to the topic in the title of the video, namely how to manage and, yes, politically profit from the realignment of the C set. The last part will, of course, be a bit controversial. Unfortunately, that argument makes no sense unless the terms of discussion are clear enough, so bear with me. The talk is divided as follows. 1. The generalized fuzzy sets theory as it applies to body politics. 2. Examples from recent history. 3. Current realignment and what makes it special. 4. Managing the C-set realignment. And 5. Some conclusions. Alright. So I outlined the basics right from the intro, but I should get into more details. Essentially, the generalized theory is essentially a more practical application of the very abstract theory of the overton window, because it can not only explain the road of one or several ideas from unthinkable to policy, but it also accepts nuances in ways the overton window theory does not. The overton window, if you want, is the theory, whilst the generalized fuzzy sets applied to body politics is the practice. And yeah, I should find a much better, shorter and less fancy name than the generalized fuzzy sets theory as applied to body politics. But anyway, names aside, the idea is predicted on several, or predicated maybe I should say, on several assumptions, which of course intrinsically bring some limitations to the theory. The assumptions are as follows. As a statistical norm, individuals change their mind quite often. Individuals change their mind as a statistical norm in fundamental ways at least twice in their lifetimes, which is why fundamental realignments happen every 40 years or so, but rarely sooner. Individuals are influenced not just by their experience, but also by the propaganda they consume. Individuals are influenced by propaganda, but at different paces. And individuals are subjected to herd mentality. All of these assumptions are, in my view, self-evident as long as we allow for outliers for whatever reason. And by that I mean some of these assumptions may not apply to small subsets of people for one or multiple reasons, such as intellect or lack thereof, grasp on emotions or lack thereof, mental health, or strong enough moral and familial structure. Once one identifies these individuals and eliminates them from the analyses, the observations drawn from the movements of sets A, B, and C becomes quite normative in the sense that it becomes very easy to predict them. Now, keep in mind that those individuals for whom the basic assumptions do not apply do not necessarily belong in set A, B, or C. For instance, David Horowitz, former bomb-throwing leftist turned conservative, is likely one of the individuals for whom some assumptions don't apply, yet he is in the B set, though some could dispute that and put him in the C set. A similar argument can be made with Noam Chomsky. He is in the A set, though an equal claim can be made of him being rather in the C set. With that being said, though, most people are not deep thinkers. Most people don't spend that much time thinking about politics, unless there is a realignment moment. More on that in a few moments. So, having established the premise, the theory goes as follows. The sets A, B, and C are rarely static. They change both in size and in content, often in imperceptible ways. And every 2 generations or so, the change is accelerated and yet another sudden realignment occurs until another equilibrium is reached, which all then last, albeit in tension, for another 2 generations or so. There's nothing sinister about this. It happens as people inevitably die off and are being replaced by newer people, either children who come of age or newcomers into the body politic, otherwise known as immigrants. The only thing a political actor can do is to find ways to manage it, or at the very least, profit from it. How you manage it is a matter of choice and political decision, but generally speaking, every political actor will try to manage it in such a way that it benefits his preferred set. But here's the catch. Only set A and set B can successfully accomplish that. Due to relative stability of the sizes of the sets, the C set cannot manage the process to benefit itself. In other words, a body politic dominated by the C set is necessarily impossible. Now, that's the good news, if you can call it that way. The bad news, however, is that the C set decides the result. Always. And again, this holds true regardless of the political system that the body politic uses. It's true in democracies, it's true in autocracies, it's true under dictatorships, feudalism, you name it. The reason this holds true is because the fuzzy sets theory as applied to body politics represents the mechanism through which the societal standard is formed. And the societal standard, as I explained in a video in March 2019, influences how a society is run, regardless of the political regime. Now, to be fair, there is an argument to be made that realignments are often triggered by intentional disruption. But I contend that disruption is merely one of the factors rather than the trigger. Others contend that, left to their own devices, the sets would have a much longer lasting equilibrium and the realignments would either not occur at all or they would be less brutal. Now, even if that were true, and I'm not convinced at all, that hypothesis cannot be tested. Why? Because we're human and therefore flawed and imperfect. So we're always going to disrupt. So any conversation of which comes first, the disruption or the realignment, is essentially moot. Sure, the political regime can try and occasionally even succeed to change or at least influence some of that, but by and large, people are gonna do what people are gonna do. Any disruption in the process, no matter how brutal, only delays the process. One extreme example would be, of course, the Soviet Union deporting and killing all of the intelligentsia in the newly added Soviet Socialist republics in order to avoid them having any ideas of independence or national revival. It took just a bit over 40 years for all of that to come back with a vengeance and eventually take down the Soviet Union itself with it. And while we're at it, Chapter 2, Examples in Recent History. So, this is probably easier to understand with examples. Here's one. In 1978, smelling a realignment, a man named Hafizullah Amin stages a revolution in Afghanistan and installs a communist government. Immediately afterwards, he proceeds to do what communists always do: kill the previous leaders, kill almost all of their supporters, and then proceed to threaten to kill anyone who disagrees with him. That ended up being known in history as the Saur Revolution. Hafizullah Amin was himself profiting off previous realignments. In the decade prior to the revolution, the factionalism in the country essentially created the stage for the revolution. A few years prior, Muhammad Dawood Khan had overthrown the monarchy and installed himself as the first president. Then he himself ended up being removed through the Saur Revolution. While the set B and set C were not exactly living in the best harmony, at least they had an equilibrium. Yet, as the Saur Revolution concluded and the radical communist reforms started being forced, the realignment, which was already in the making anyway, arrived to Afghanistan. The new C set would end up being known as the Mujahideen. You might be familiar with that term. The new B set would end up being comprised by former members of the A set who disagreed with the revolutionary tactics and the former members of the C set who did not want to become Mujahideens. The new A set would end up being comprised by all of the communists plus the former members of the B and C sets who had chosen the path of collaborationism, and thus started the struggle to influence and manage this realignment. The Soviet Union threw its support behind A set, China, Iran, Pakistan, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Saudi Arabia threw its support behind the B and or the C set. One thing led to another: a boycott here, a boycott there, sanctions, military aid, covert operations, offshore training, sounds familiar, and the Soviet Union collapsed. At least in part because of it throwing its support behind the A set in Afghanistan. I like this example a lot because it's one of the few examples where the theory appears to be contradicted. After all, the former C set, the Mujahideens, now the Taliban, are now running the country, and the theory says that the C set cannot run things for itself. But the theory is not contradicted. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, that C set from that time tried to run things, but failed. Factionalism and lack of coherence made it impossible for the C set to run things, even though it was free from outside influence or interference. It took another almost 3 years and 2 more wars for the Taliban to take power, and the Taliban of today are not the C set from 1992 or 1980. The current Taliban are the elite of the B set. The original members of the C set in 1980 are either dead or very old now to matter. Also, the theory holds even better if we also note that only 25% of the financial support for the Mujahideens came from the states. The rest came from individuals in the wider Muslim world. So, if we look at the Muslim world as a body politic in itself, then things are even clearer. Here's another example. Abolition of slavery. Where? Everywhere. There is no place on earth where abolition of slavery just happened. Nope. Every single time there was a B set that co-opted a C set in order to impose its will upon the A set. Most recently, Uzbekistan finally de facto abolished slavery in March 2022. De jure, it had been abolished in 2020. Believe it or not, it was for cotton. But this didn't happen all of a sudden. It happened gradually as the B set figured out a way to co-opt the C set against the A set. The set A are the pro-regime people, set B are the people who wanted to abolish slavery, and set C are the weirdos by Uzbek standards. They started in 1989 with set B arguing that the Soviet Union sent disproportionately Uzbek men to die in Afghanistan for communist ideals. Admittedly, set B also helped a bit. The MI6 had distributed radical anti-communist Islamic propaganda. That helped a lot in turning the set C into a more willing partner. It also forced a bit of a realignment. The more religious members of set A switched to set B, while the more communist members of set C moved to set A. The argument was that any material benefit derived from being part of the Soviet Union pales in comparison to the losses suffered by Uzbek people as a result of not being independent and also as a result of Moscow's adventure in neighboring Afghanistan. Well, that worked out only partially. You see, the USSR fell and Uzbekistan got its independence, but not exactly as expected. They got the right to leave the country whenever they wanted, but also got themselves under the personal rule of Islam Karimov. I will tell you the whole story about that in the upcoming series from Central Asia, but for the purposes of this talk, it's worth noting that liberty from slavery improved only for a tiny part of the country. Fearing the set C, Karimov went as far as to ban the Islamic call to prayer from being broadcasted, a ban lifted only after his death in contemporaneity, and to bring the kind of repression not seen since Stalin, essentially. Calls continued to abolish most of the stringent aspect of slavery, namely the mandatory cotton-picking time, which applied to all students, including minors, most teachers, some doctors, and other categories of people, around 1 million people in total each year. But it was only in 2014 when a combination of overconfidence from some students, emboldened by the rumors that the dictator is in bad health, exaggeration from the regime, and an unrelated protest that ended up badly, only then the call was heard loud enough. That still wasn't enough, but it was the turning point. Slowly, the sets had started to realign. People moved from set A to set B. Not many, but enough alongside the set C to shift the societal standard. 2 years later, when the dictator died and got replaced by Shavkat Mirziyoyev, the man to whom the 2014 protest letters were addressed, suddenly outside pressure worked. By 2018, it was mainstream topic that the system of forced labor has to go, but it took another 4 years until March of this year till Uzbekistan finally became slavery-free. The same story is everywhere where slavery was finally abolished. In the US, slavery wasn't abolished in 1863 with the proclamation. De jure, it was abolished in December 1865. De facto? Depends on who you ask. Uzbekistan's style of slavery continued in the United States way into the 1930s, and it required even more realignments and technological progress until the practice was finally gone. What I'm trying to say here is that realignments are not necessarily good or bad. Afghanistan is an example of realignments leading essentially to, well, a clusterfuck. Abolition of slavery is a success story, but there are also other examples of realignments with a mixed result. The rise of Protestantism, for instance. There is certainly both good and bad to be extracted from that realignment. The realignments that took place in the 1950s in the Intermarium, almost all of them were for the worse. The reason I'm mentioning this is to emphasize repeatedly that the generalized fuzzy sets theory is not meant to predict good or bad outcomes. It's meant to be a tool to predict trends for political operatives, intellectuals, and other influencers. What these people do with these predictions is a choice. Not doing anything is also a choice, by the way. Also, keep in mind that while it applies everywhere, it is limited by geography. That's why it's called the generalized fuzzy sets theory as applied to body politics. We don't have a global body politic, despite multiple claims to the contrary by certain members of Set A of certain countries. Sure, one body politic can influence another one and trigger similar, although by no means identical, realignments. So, for instance, Americans' decision to vote for Obama led to an influence upon other body politics outside of the American body politic. In any event, Chapter 3. Current realignment and what makes it special. So, I was saying in the intro that the last profound realignment occurred in the 1980s and we're due for another one. Well, I will refer primarily to the Northern Hemisphere. Obviously, it wasn't one realignment, but rather several realignments occurring somewhere between 1978 and 1985 or so. But they all yielded very similar results. So, in this interval, the following events happened. Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher get elected. Anti-communist Cardinal Karl Józef Wojtyła is ordained as Pope John Paul II. The entire founding Revolutionary Guard of the People's Republic of China dies of old age between 1975 and 1979. Leonid Brezhnev dies in 1982 and triggers fundamental instability into the USSR's leadership. In the next 3 years, the USSR changes 3 leaders. Eventually, Gorbachev rises to power and starts shaking the system. Profiting off the instability, opposition to communism becomes a lot more common than ever throughout the intermarium. Late 1970s also marked the first daring moves to undermining the communist regimes by regular people rather than state actors. I'm thinking here of Roger Scruton's trips to hold samizdat classes. The energy crisis is finally over with the creation of the petrodollar, which brings unprecedented optimism in the market. Each of these events happened separately. There is no way one could have coordinated them, and each of them has a clear logic. After all, Mao was 82, Brezhnev was 76, the new pope had to be elected, so, coordinated such things globally was not possible, but so was ignoring biology. However, when taken together, these events facilitated a realignment. Former supporters of communist regimes suddenly changed their mind. Open dissidence became not just increasingly common, but increasingly unavoidable. Events that would have gone unnoticed 10 years earlier led to quite massive movements of open dissidence, such as the murder of Grzegorz Pczemyk, a 19-year-old killed by the notoriously brutal communist-era police in Poland under Jaruzelski's martial law. Quite a few such incidents had happened before, but this one stuck and led to huge protests, and the regime's disproportionate reaction only further radicalized the opposition, which just a few years earlier would have ignored it, and just a few years later would outright seize power. Meanwhile, with the energy crisis over and over-optimism in the market, more people were willing to think with the pocketbook rather than feelings. After all, anti-communist leaders in the West had existed prior to Reagan or Thatcher, but they didn't quite catch on like these two because it wasn't the right time. The point that I'm making here is that the realignments from 1980-ish mattered a lot more than the obvious realignments from 1990. If anything, the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and yes, the New World Order that followed, were simply the logical continuation of the realignments that had happened 10 years before. Okay, so what about the present day? Well, between the year 2000 and 2010, slow realignments occurred as a result of events, such as disillusionment with left-wing populism happened in Greece with Syriza, which came and went for the most part, happened in the US with the Occupy Wall Street, just look up all of the big fans from them. They're almost all now part of the Set B or Set C, or have simply gone quiet. It happened in France, though with quite a bit of a delay. Euroscepticism became mainstream. In 2000, Euroscepticism was basically non-existent. When I started writing about the illegitimacy of the European Union in 2005, I personally knew half of all of the writers with Eurosceptic views in all of Europe. That wasn't because I was such an important person, I wasn't, but because Euroscepticism was simply rare. By 2010, Euroscepticism was mainstream. More people moved to the B set on that than ever before in the previous 40 years of existence of the Европейский Союз. Slowly, more people understood how finance works, some forced by circumstances as a result of the financial crisis of 2008-2010, others simply because information finally reached them. Today, it's mainstream to discuss about the trade-offs of a fiat currency or about the pitfalls of central banks. And you can easily find discussions about that quite out in the open, and you can expect more people than ever to at least understand the nomenclature. In 2000, such thing would have been unimaginable. The very terminology was something only nerds might have understood. Also, while opposition to left-wing social policy has always existed, it was the mid-2000s that saw the rise of such arguments all the way up to the mainstream. For instance, anti-feminism is at least 120 years old, but it was the mid-2000s that saw the rise of full-time organizations on this topic, which they would later on create entire schools of thought and even get their own mainstream university professors. I should know, because I was part of the phenomenon. I routinely get a kicker when I hear talking points that I personally wrote 15 years ago, now used verbatim on some left-wing states. Anyway, all things considered, all of these small realignments from the turn of the century are now leading us to a bigger one, which is in fact currently happening. So, in the last 5 or 6 years, the following things have happened or will soon happen. Brexit, the very idea of exiting the Eurosayuz was unthinkable in 2001. The election of openly anti-feminist and anti-progressive leaders, there were basically zero such cases before 2015. After 2015, well, Jair Bolsonaro, Donald Trump, Yoon Suk-yeol in South Korea. In fact, South Korea is a confirmation. Before the presidential election, the mayoral election in Seoul had also delivered a staunch right-wing anti-feminist win. A 36-year-old who called feminism unconstitutional and fascistic won the mayor's office of a global city. This was unimaginable in 2005 or even 2010. In fact, when it comes to anti-progressivism, even communist China is on the same trend. When it doubles down on anti-feminism, that's when the CCP's popularity grows. Again, unimaginable 20 years ago. Let's not forget that the CCP is the party of women hold up half the sky. Look up that slogan and read about it. Anyway, also in the last 5 or 6 years, the leadership in the United States became locked into a bunch of old farts. Biden is 80, Pelosi is 82, Trump is 76, Mitch McConnell is 80, Chuck Schumer is 71. You get the point. Just like in the 1980 in the Soviet Union, the leadership in the United States is decrepit. Its average age is deceased. Russia is no better. Putin is 70, Lavrov is 72, Sergei Shoigu is 70, which by Russia standards, they're already beyond the median life expectancy. Average age of the Kremlin cabinet is deceased. And then, of course, also in the last few years, the COVID madness happened. While you're told on TV that everyone has been through it, that's just not true. It was a phenomenon almost exclusively of wealthy countries. There was no COVID madness in Uzbekistan or Kyrgyzstan or most of Brazil or Mexico or most of Africa. Places with large population and, for the most part, demographic growth. The COVID madness merely accelerated pre-existent trends which are slowly but consistently pointing towards profound realignments. Fewer people than ever trust their governments in the wealthier countries, and the trend looks unstoppable. And I say it looks unstoppable because it's not unstoppable. It will eventually stabilize and grow back, but that's only after the realignment. Also, people thrive on symbols. Well, Queen Elizabeth II just died, and nobody likes Charles. He had 50 years of making a fool out of himself, so he doesn't get the benefit of the doubt. On the political front, the smaller realignments I was discussing earlier are starting to manifest in ways unimaginable in 2010. In Sweden, the socially conservative Sverigedemokraterna delivered a stunning result. All while, for the last 10 years, the experts insisted that it will go away if you just simply apply enough social media censorship and keep a cordon sanitaire against them. Well, tough luck. It ain't happening. Italy just got a very socially conservative prime minister, and all of Europe is slowly moving into an era of fractured parliaments or socially conservative governance. France's election yielded a fractured parliament. This hasn't happened in decades. Bulgaria just held its fourth election in under 2 years. Germany's duopoly just ended. All of these reflect deep realignments. Now, I'm taping this before the midterms in the United States, but even having on the ballot candidates like J.D. Vance for Senate in Ohio, or Carrie Lake for governor in Arizona, Ron DeSantis for re-election in Florida, Blake Masters for Senate in Arizona, and quite a few others, also speaks about this realignment. Again, this is not me necessarily liking these people. In fact, I'm not a big fan of J.D. Vance, for instance, but whether you and me like these people or not, their very existence at this level shows just how much the electorate changed. All of these fancy byline people complain that politics has changed. Well, it hasn't. But the electorate changed quite a bit, yes. And they want something else, and they will get something else. If the people got something else in an autocracy that had slavery until just a few months ago, like Uzbekistan, you can rest assured they will get something else in Europe and the United States. Okay, so there is a realignment. But what makes it special? Well, aside from the fact that we get to watch it in real time, which is in itself something special, this realignment is the first one in over 200 years that is not well instrumentalized yet. For instance, the rise of political correctness was instrumentalized to offshore manufacturing. The rise of a noisy socially conservative minority, evangelicals that is, was instrumentalized to accelerate the downfall of the USSR. Every realignment was eventually instrumentalized by someone. This one, well, for now at least, nobody seems to even try, and that can be dangerous, because if nobody does it, then the enemy will. Sure, a lot are focused on Russia attempting to instrumentalize it, and there are serious and legitimate arguments in that direction, but Russia isn't the only player. For instance, TikTok, the de facto owned by the CCP, is working tirelessly in over-promoting very extreme woke bullcrap on Westerners, whilst at the same time over-promoting useful content at home. Random login on TikTok from China gives you clips with useful life advice. The same in the West gives you instructions on how to become transgender. This will not bode well. Also, a more serious institutional collapse in the West would not benefit Russia that much, but it would benefit China tremendously. But aside from the dangers of it, the fact that so few even try to understand the current realignment is also due to the fact that way too many of those who should know better are either disconnected or afraid. For instance, a lot of the potential negative effects of the realignment can be managed by simply turning up the volume of the most moderate critics and turning down the volume of the crazies. It's not hard. Just don't sponsor groomer events, denounce the whole COVID-19 madness, fire 100 visible people and place the boot on the neck of some unions, starting with the police and teachers unions. If every regime in Europe and the regime in the United States would do this, most of the potential negative effects would be cancelled within 3 years. And I'm being very precise in my language here when I say the regime. So I'm not talking about Biden or Liz Truss or what's the other guy's name, the new prime minister, or Macron or Rutte or whatever. No. I'm talking about the regime. Rationally, it is in the regime's best interest to do what I suggested. But the regime won't do that. Just like the Jaruzelski regime refused to simply jail 2 police officers and apologize for the death of Grzegorz Przemyk. Just like the Ceausescu regime refused to lift social restrictions after 1986. By tradition, the regime is ignorant because power corrupts. That's why figures like Gorbachev or Deng Xiaoping or Helmut Kohl tend to be remembered despite their enormous faults. Because when the time of realignment came, they understood the situation slightly better and tried to adapt the regime. Sure, they didn't fully succeed, but at least they prevented the worst-case scenario. Now imagine the breakup of the Soviet Union without Gorbachev. let's say it would have been a trigger shit show, a bigger shit show than it actually was. Or in the case of Deng Xiaoping, he quite literally saved the CCP. Again, the theory of fuzzy sets is a tool to predict things, not a tool to find morally good things. While saving the CCP is, in my estimation, a morally reprehensible result, the fact remains that Deng Xiaoping and the regime then was cognizant of these realities. Deng Xiaoping is the president of China during the Tiananmen massacre, for those who may not know. And because nobody is trying, at least not seriously trying, to instrumentalize or manage this realignment, this means two things. One, that the realignment will happen with more vengeance, which means both more good things and more bad things. And two, it means that it's open season for everyone to try to influence it. And so with that, Chapter 4, Managing the CSET Realignment. All right, so everything so far was the introduction. The point of this video is, after all, political strategy. That's why people come to Freedom Alternative, not for academic lectures. So, I said in the intro that the CSET never gets to rule, but they almost always decide the final result. Well, when a realignment is occurring, the direction of the CSET matters equally to the direction of movements between sets A and set B. Why? Because in a profound realignment like the one we're going through right now, the CSET is essentially replaced. Very few of the people who are in the CSET right now were there 10 years ago. And very few of the people who were in the category C 10 years ago are still there today. Even fewer in the next 2 years. To cut to the chase, because this video is, already getting longer than I wanted it to be, the right, or set B, will have to integrate the old crop of loonies and to make sure it pushes those it can't integrate into set A rather than allowing them to spoil the new set C. The alternative to that would be to bet on the ability to grow the B set so large as to not need the new set C. That plan, history shows, has very little chances of succeeding. It can work. There are examples of it working, whether set A or set B became so big for a while that they didn't need set C to rule, but those examples also benefited from extraordinary circumstances, or one side integrated the entirety of set C and benefited from the time lag until a new set C formed. So, in that respect, there is also the third way, integrate all of the loonies, but as things stand, that's impossible. The set C is way too diverse for such an effort to be successful either for set A or set B. However, the following 2 years must be focused on this realignment, with a view to garner as much new support as possible for set B, whether through integration or recruiting as adjacent. And there are three main directions through which to approach this realignment. Direction 1, ideological. Direction 2, common aspiration. Direction 3, common enemy. The ideological direction is the hardest one, first of all because not everyone can assess it properly. Then there is the issue that it takes time and it's a frustrating effort. I mean, there's plenty of people in set C that are simply crazy. Even if you may agree with them ideologically, they're still crazy and a source of instability, and thus a liability for set B. Personally, I avoid this direction of approach with people in set C. I only take this route for people in set A. Why? Because people in set A are rational actors, for the most part anyway, and can thus be convinced. Again, remember that set A contains your average Social Democrat voter, not just the party strategists and the entrenched ideologues. Now, you can't convince those, but you can take away their base. This already happened in my neck of the woods in 2020. The Nationalist Party got 10%. Half of those were people who used to vote for the Social Democrats. It will likely happen again in other countries. It already happened in Italy this year. It has been happening constantly in Sweden. And perhaps most importantly, it's been happening for 5 years straight in the United States. Remember the walk away campaign from 4 years ago? Well, it worked. Here's one example.
Good evening. Thank you everyone for this opportunity to speak tonight. I'm here today because I am concerned about the current and future state of our education system. I'm a Miami native and a product of the MDCPS system. I'm also a gay man, and as a gay man, I understand the importance of a healthy and balanced education. I understand the importance in diversity of thought, and ultimately, I understand the importance of unbiased development. What is happening right now is no longer acceptance. It's no longer the support my community needed in the 90s and early 2000s. It's indoctrination. I do not use the word lightly, but it's the truth. The children deserve an education that will develop them, give them a platform for critical thinking and problem solving so that we can push and create a better future. What we are pushing right now is not that. We are moving in a direction that will create entitled, confused, depressed, and potentially dangerous adults. Providing support and being accepting is very different from promoting and encouraging a certain lifestyle. Growing up, I had people who supported me and loved me unconditionally. I also had people who disagreed with me and maybe disliked me because of my sexuality. Not only was that okay, but it was vital to my development. Not only I learned how to interact and find common ground with anyone and everyone. I learned that it's okay not to agree on everything. Legislation and policies do not encourage positive change. People do. If you feel LGBT youth need more support, support them yourself as an individual. There are plenty of private organizations that provide youth with things like counseling.
Please, let's not applause. Thank you.
Counseling, community, and financial help are available to LGBT youth. Parents must be in 100% control of their child's development and education. The education system has been hijacked by people who push their agendas disguised as social justice warriors. I am gay. I am not oppressed. I am not being attacked. I'm not abused. Please treat me the same as everyone else. I remember when we were fighting to be equal, and now we're fighting to have an entire month celebrating my sexuality and parades. I don't need that. I really don't. That is exclusivity. That is not inclusivity. I don't want to be excluded. So please treat me the same as everyone else. Okay? One day I will have children, and they will definitely not be attending a public school, and I'm going to work my butt off so that I can put them in a very nice school.
This was unimaginable in 2018 when Walkaway took off. That's a man who got gradually convinced, ideologically. How do I know that? Well, it's rarely the case that someone who is in set A gets up into the morning to go and attend a school board meeting to virulently argue for the case of set B without being convinced. That's how I know it. The ideological direction for the members of Set C is, however, much more complicated, because you'd have to first convince them of some basic facts that aren't even connected to politics. Besides, this direction aims at integrating, and as I said, integrating members of Set C is, generally speaking, not advisable. And that's why there is the direction of common aspirations. This direction is not constrictive. It doesn't necessarily require integration and leaves the maximum leeway for the political operative, which is why my go-to direction, this one is my go-to direction whenever I interact with a member of Set C. You may believe that Klaus Schwab is going to force-feed you with bugs, or you may believe that Joe Biden is a space lizard, though to be fair, the jury is still out on that one, or heck, you may even believe property is immoral. But if you're willing to admit that we're allowed to disagree on all of that while at the same time agree on, let's say, getting groomers out of schools or on school choice or whatever set of policies, small or big, then I'm open to collaboration. You don't have to join Set B. What's a bit more complicated with this direction is when it comes to other subsets of Set C, such as religious fundamentalists. There are quite significant amount of common aspirations between Set B and religious fundamentalists, and a very short list of key differences. So the question is, should Set B in this realignment seek to integrate them or leave them in Set C and only collaborate? And there is no universal answer to this. It depends on the body politic we apply the theory to, and it also depends on the kind of religious fundamentalists, both as individuals and as subgroups. So, for instance, in my neck of the woods, integration is, generally speaking, possible and even desirable, with very few exceptions. But at the same time is not true in places like Sweden, where religious fundamentalists either means feminists or adherents to a certain religion of special needs. So, there's that. But ultimately, since the realignment happens more randomly than usual, it's up to you as individual to make the decision on a case-by-case basis. Generally, just don't look too much into broad agreement, but rather this. Can this individual be a reliable voter that can also be activated from time to time for low-tier activism? If yes, then that's good enough. After all, it's on these kinds of people that the B set relied on when launching its counteroffensive on school boards in the United States. People who don't necessarily agree on everything or even most of the convictions of set B, but agree with enough to also get out of the chair from time to time when precise conditions are met. Remember, set B, just like set A, is not just for activists or knowledgeable people, or even articulate people. I mean, give me a poorly educated, inarticulate person that has a drive to win and similar aspirations, and I will find room for them in set B. That's for sure. And then there's the third direction, the common enemy. This one is exclusively for collaboration. You don't integrate members of set C with whom you only have common enemies. The enemy of my enemy can be my ally, but not necessarily my friend. Luckily, set B has exercised this very well over the last 2 years in quite a few countries. All we need is to take the lessons learned and keep applying them going forward. Those of you who worked on this during the so-called pandemic are keenly aware of what I mean. After all sorts of people joined on the loose coalition to oppose sanitary fascism. You wouldn't want many of those in your house permanently, but in a temporary tent on a policy-by-policy basis? Yes, of course, why not? Chapter 5. Some conclusions. Ultimately, this realignment will happen regardless of anyone's opinion about it. And some of its aspects are impossible to predict. We may end up in really honk places, both in small ways and in big ways. For instance, in the 1960s, the very idea of a lifelong Democrat and liberal intellectual Zbigniew Brzezinski working with not just one but 3 Republican administrations would have seemed impossible, unthinkable. Yet, following the realignment of late 1970s, that's exactly what happened. There are multiple examples from the past of things unimaginable ending up happening as a result of profound realignments. Some of those are currently being repeated. Just look it up. Even in the alternative media, how many of the personalities currently being strongly in set B used to be either in set A or set C just 10 years ago? Heck, this is true in big politics as well. Plenty of currently set B politicians and pundits started out in set A. Here I would mention Orbán Viktor, Giorgia Meloni, Traian Băsescu, or indeed Mateusz Morawiecki. All of these recent politicians have quite a noticeable left-wing past. And it's true of many pundits and influencers as well. I mentioned earlier David Horowitz, former bomb-throwing leftists. But there are others, more contemporary examples, such as Tim Pool, Christopher Rufo, who now makes the New York Times and teachers' unions tremble on just hearing his name, or up to even more controversial people like Alexei Arestovich, who makes every single Russian shill get into heavy trepidation upon the mentioning of his name. All of these people have a set A background of some kind. And these kinds of people can be very useful, especially if they bring with them knowledge from set A. For instance, Rufo has been called, more like a joke, a right-wing Leninist because he views structures of power through an excessively institutional lens, something which both left-wing and right-wing establishmentarians do. But unlike other right-wingers, he also comes up with excessively institutional answers to the problems identified, and those policies also tend to work in attaining the objective. But while Rufo is definitely not a Leninist, it is true that his way of approaching the problem is more specific to set A rather than set B. So there's that. Same goes for Steve Bannon and quite a few others. So to sum up, what activists should be doing is observing this process and intervene whenever it is convenient. Remember that nobody can stop this process. Many have tried throughout history, including with brutal violence, and they all failed. But enough interventions while it is happening can shape the body politic closer to the direction we desire. at least for a while. Then the process starts over, again and again, till the end of times. That's why I snark at black pillars, because if the fight had been lost, there would be no need for such entrenched battles from the establishment. Set A is shrinking, and the smart ones in set A know that they will need to make sure it's not set B that is growing, but rather set C. It is our job to grow set B and ensure the collaboration of set C. It really is that simple. And remember, politics is like European football. There is always the next season. Nothing is permanent. If that had been the case, Chelsea London would have stayed in the second division rather than be the untethered European champions. If things had been permanent, the Sweden Democrats would have remained in their 3% polling. As late as 2006, that's where Sverigedemokraterna stood. Yet in the middle of September 2022, they shook everyone by becoming the second largest party in the country and continue their long march through institutions. If things had been permanent, Rassemblement National in France would have remained the party of boomer reactionaries that it was in the 1990s, instead of climbing to the third place by gaining 10 times more seats than the last round. And with that also solving all of its financial problems and now controlling key committees with which it can stop the regime in more ways than imagined even just 2 years ago. All of these were possible and will continue to be possible thanks to this realignment. The better we manage it, the more results we can squeeze out of it. It really is that simple. And with all of that being said, thank you all for watching. Thank you for your continuous and generous financial support. Don't forget to subscribe, visit our website, and if you like what we do, consider a donation. I'll see you all soon on the Freedom Alternative.